Hi, everybody. I wanted to share a story with you today. It's a story about a young man named Jack. Now, when Jack was growing up, he was a PK, or a pastor's kid. He grew up in the church. He grew up with all the hymns. He grew around the Christian faith. And, by all means, he was, a pretty decent person. He did some things he weren't supposed to, but we all do things like that when we're teenagers. We want to rebel. We want to go our own way, and things like that happen. But one day he found himself done with high school, and he found himself leaving home, and he headed off to the big wide world of college and all the adventure that awaited him there. Well, when he got to college, the classes started, and they were a little bit more difficult than Jack first imagined. He was never the best student anyway, so he had to really study, a lot. He had to find tutors, and before long, he began to get pretty stressed out from school, and he wanted some release. So he started hanging around with some people who were drinking a lot. He wasn't old enough, but that doesn't stop college-age kids from doing those things. So he started drinking a lot, and then the drinking led to other groups of people, and marijuana was passed around, and then he got into some other fairly serious drugs, and this kind of just went out of control for a while. And school was there again. It was just like a side thing, though. He was doing okay. He managed to pull down a couple of B's, a couple of C's, but he wasn't doing great. But he wasn't failing either. He'd make the weekly phone call home to his mom and dad and say, "Hey, I'm doing really, really, really good," and pretty much just lying about his state. A lot of his friends, though, from high school that he hung around with at youth group, and some of his Christian friends, he lost contact with. They would connect with him on social media, but they were doing stuff he didn't want to do. He wanted to just hang out with his new friends, if you will, and he wanted to drink. He wanted to smoke, and he wanted to do the fun drugs because, again, that was the fun thing to do. Well, this went on for about a year and a half, and he didn't really let on. Every chance he got, when he had to go home for the summer, he'd make excuses to go somewhere else and be away. So he pretty much alienated all of his high school friends except for one, and her name was Elizabeth, and he would keep touch a little bit, but really, really not much. Well, he had gone back to school, and one night he was out and he was partying with a couple of his friends, and they decided to go get something to eat because they were really hungry. So they got into somebody else's car and they started driving down the road, and unfortunately there was an accident. It was just a single car accident, so nobody else was involved. Just the person driving it was just too much under the influence. And it's a pretty bad accident as well, at least it was for Jack. Well, when Jack woke up in the hospital, the first face he saw was that of his friend, Elizabeth from his hometown, and he just looked at her and he said, "Well, what are you doing here?" And she just smiled and said, "Well, I'm here, because your mom and dad went down to get something to eat. They've been here a while." And again, Jack was confused. He says, "Well, what do you mean they've been here a while? How long have I been here?" And she said, "You've been unconscious for about 2 days now." And Jack was just, wow, like, what happened? And so Elizabeth told him, based on police reports and things, that there had been this accident and that he was just found by a passing car. He says, "Wait a minute, I think I had friends in that car." And he says, "Yeah, there was registered to somebody else, but they left the scene of the accident." Actually, the driver actually left the state because he was afraid he was going to get into trouble, and the authorities were actually trying to track this particular person down. Now, Jack was pretty upset that his new friends in college, would have just left him there. In a wreck, bleeding. He could have very easily died. He had gone to the hospital. They had done some emergency surgeries, and they had corrected the things that were wrong. But it was going to take a while. It's going to take a while in that hospital for him to be able to get out. And about a week and a half went by, and he got healthy enough where the medical staff felt that he could go home. But every single day when he was in that hospital, Elizabeth came to visit. And she lived about 2 hours away. But after her own school and her own work, she would drive those 2 hours to be with Jack. She would just be there in the room with him. She would just talk to him, and they just tried to rekindle that relationship that they had back in high school. Well, they got home, and Mom and Dad were there for Jack, and they helped every time they could. And there were still some issues with him walking and things like this as well, but he was definitely getting better. Mom and Dad, though, they never mentioned the drinking. They never mentioned the drugs, and they knew now what had been going on because they had talked to the school and his other acquaintances there. They never brought it up, though. When he was home, they just said, "Are you comfortable? Can we get you anything?" They looked past all of that, and they just loved him because he's their son. Now, between Elizabeth and Jack, they got into some pretty deep discussions about everything, including what Jack had been up to and what Elizabeth had been up to. And Elizabeth, though, for her credit, she didn't really chastise Jack too much. She didn't tell him what you're doing was wrong. You shouldn't have been doing drugs all the time and drinking to excess, and you shouldn't have been in that car. She thought it, but she didn't say it. And part of that was because she didn't have to, because I think Jack saw that in her eyes when they would talk about it. Well, things got a little bit more serious between Jack and Elizabeth as the following weeks progressed. And Jack realized that he really, really, really liked Elizabeth a lot. And he felt that Elizabeth liked him too, because why else would she be spending all of that time with him? And so one day he just said, "You know what, I'd like to take this to the next level. I'd like to have you officially be my girlfriend." And she smiled at him, and she just looked at him, and he waited for a response. And it took a while. But eventually Elizabeth simply said, "Well, I'll consider that on one condition, that you go to church with me this Sunday." And Jack was a little taken back. He wasn't expecting that. He said, "Go to church?" He goes, "Yeah, I just want you to go to church with me." And he said, "Well, let me think about that." Because Jack had been away from church for a while, right? He didn't want to go back just for the sake of going back, because he knew if he went back and just didn't believe any of it, that Elizabeth wouldn't have anything to do with him. Because he knew her faith. And if he wasn't in that same faith, it probably wasn't going to work out. And it probably wouldn't have. People with different faiths don't work out too well sometimes, unfortunately. Well, a couple of days went by, and he thought about it a lot, and he finally called Elizabeth up and says, "You know what? Yes, I will go to church this Sunday with you." And she goes, "That's great. That's great." So they got into church, and he looked around the church, like you all do, and go, "Okay, when's the building going to fall down?" And it didn't. People who saw him there received him, accepted him. And then the pastor got up, and the pastor kept droning on and on, as pastors do. But the thing is, this pastor was preaching on the Gospel of Luke 15. And this particular gospel deals with the story of the prodigal son. You remember that story about the son going to the father and saying, "Hey, I want my inheritance now because I want to get out of here because I don't like what's going on. I want to be on my own. I want to be my own person." So the dad gives him an inheritance, and the son leaves home, and he spends all of his money in wild living, a lot like Jack did. And in the gospel here, what happens though is that this son runs out of money. And there's a famine in the land, and he is in great need. He can't find food. He can't find work. He gets a job with a guy just feeding the pigs, and he just longs to eat what the pigs are eating. He needs something, and he decides to go back home. because he feels like his dad's a nice guy and his dad's going to help him. And he says, I'm going to go home and tell Dad that I'm sorry, that I've sinned against him and against God, and can I just have a job, please, any job, so I can have food? But when this young man goes back home, his father sees him, and he runs to him, and his arms open wide, and he just embraces his son, because he was lost. And he came home. And he puts a ring on his finger and the finest robe on his shoulders because it is his son. And he wants him to be home. He doesn't talk about what the son had done. He doesn't criticize him. He just accepts him. And he loves him. And he comes back home. And when Jack heard that in this particular parable, which he'd heard a million times before, something happened. Because he realized that he was that prodigal son. That he had gotten himself lost and far away from God. But that God was there to receive him back. Elizabeth was there. His mom and dad were there. He had connected to some other friends that he had not seen for a while as well. And he realized, really, probably the first time in a long time, that he was home. He was home in the church. He was home in his relationship, and he realized that God wasn't going to judge him. Ever. That God was just going to love him. And when he thought this, a tear ran down his cheek. And he felt a hand upon his hand. And it grabbed it. And he looked over and he saw Elizabeth, because it was her hand upon his, and she had a tear running down her cheek as well. Because she knew in her heart what had just happened. That her friend, her close friend, had been found once again. And I think that's so important for all of us in this life. To know that we can never travel so far that God won't take us back again. Without judgment, without condemnation, but to receive us once again with love, and to put the coat upon us, inviting us in for that meal, and just loving us as only God can. So it's my prayer that no matter where you are at in your life, that you know this, and that there's always that ability to go back to God. So maybe today we all need to sit back and realize how lost we might be, and just ask God to take us back and just revel in the warmth and the comfort of being with our Lord and being with our Creator and our Maker, and with Christ as well. You take care. Have a great and amazing day. And we'll talk to you soon.